gotten older, I've kind of stopped paying attention to it as much. So not as familiarized with all the cool bodybuilding stuff.
Yeah, that's okay. Can't be good at everything, right?
That's fair. I'm trying, man. I always say, I was like, oh yeah, I'd much rather just, I enjoy being lean and having, like abs and things like that. It's mostly just because I'm jealous and envious of the big bodybuilders. And I know that I can't do it or don't have the time to dedicate to it. That's probably the real reason.
Might as well just stay. If I can't be massive, I might as well just stay lean. So I at least have one thing going for me. It's just looking like a marshmallow man.
It's not that I can't, or I don't think I could be massive. It's like, I don't really want to have to eat that much food.
I mean, that's the fun part, is being able to just eat all day.
Yes, I guess it depends on what I'm eating and if I'm willing to risk. Or I'm getting older, not in my prime anymore. Do I want to risk my health by just slamming McDonald's? I don't want to be. Not that I am anti this person at all. I don't want to be CT. And have quadruple bypass and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But what are the odds, right?
Yeah. So, anyways, all right, Garrett, tell me what we're talking about today.
How hard do I need to work out in order to get gains? That's the question. Question of the day is how hard should I push myself? How much should I do to really actually be a big person?
I always say that you didn't have a good workout if you don't throw up at the very end of the workout.
That's the only way. I want, when I get done, if I get on a bicep day, my arms aren't automatically being held up here as I'm walking out of the gym.
Basically on leg day,
I didn't do enough.
On leg day, if I either bring my wheelchair or I walk out on my hands. And
if I can't walk the next day after a leg day, that means I did it right.
I actually need a bone sticking out of my leg.
Yeah. If you didn't
pop it and then pop it back in place.
If you didn't pull a groin or tear an ACL, what are you doing? You just really need to get out. You're wasting time. You're wasting everybody's time waiting on you to get your work in. Get out of there. Go do something else.
Yes, all of the above. So basically, I guess everybody knows that, though. So if we want it, or if we're checking to the pipsqueaks that are not willing to do what it takes, I guess, what else would you say we're talking about?
Yeah. So
workout.
All right, for real. If we're talking about pure hypertrophy training, which we are, because I don't care about the training for general health, training for strength gains. I don't care about any of that. I just want, how do I make me as big as possible? I want me as big as me can get.
Yes.
So just for pure hypertrophy purposes, I think your best bet is to train pretty close to failure. Now, how close might depend on a couple of things. And we also probably need to define exactly what failure is.
How about this? Define volume.
You can define that a couple different ways. Some people just do reps times sets. There's your volume. Some people do reps times sets and then an intensity factor as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of depends. And again, the intensity factor is going to depend on what your definition of failure is. I typically say failure as being technical breakdown, so being technical failure, as opposed to actual muscular failure. Again, this is for hypertrophy. So in hypertrophy training, you're looking to achieve maximal activation of whatever muscle we're trying to work. So if I'm doing bicep curls, I'm wanting to maximally activate my bicep. So I'm not going to want to be doing any kind of the momentum lifting when I'm fatigued. So whenever that begins, that's really usually when I initially, okay, here's the line. Once I can no longer do a curl with proper form, now that's your failure. That's going to be your marker for judging your intensity. So generally, I like to put my training and my clients and athletes training 1 to 2 reps away from that. So 1 or 2 reps away from technical failure, not mechanical or muscular failure, when you can just like physically no longer do one more.
Yeah.
I think there is a good place for that sometimes. I think it's a useful tool in the tool belt to be used occasionally. And again, only in intermediate to advanced lifters. So I typically have my athletes and clients go about 1 to 2 RIR. So for those of us who don't know the lingo, RIR is reps in reserve. Mm-hmm. So how many reps do I have left in the tank? So if I'm working at a 2 RIR, that typically is going to mean I could only do 2 more reps left before I reach technical failure. The flip side to that is RPE, which maybe more people are probably more familiar with. Mm-hmm. So a 2 RIR would be working at like an RPE 8. So at 8 out of 10, that's your rating of perceived exertion scale. So 8 out of 10 there is just, I usually like to say RIR. People usually get a good, have a good idea for like, all right, you can only have 2 reps left in the tank. People usually are better at understanding that. Now they also people need to understand what their definition of failure is. People need to know what that point looks like for them. If they've never taken a movement to actual failure, then they don't have a good reference point for what RIR actually is. Mm-hmm. So if they've never taken squats to mechanical or technical failure, then they're not going to have a good reference point. Then they might be like, all right, that feels like I probably do 2 more. But in reality, they could have repped out 4 or 5 more.
Right.
So you need to like set that baseline first, where people understand, okay, here's where failure is. Now I need to be, if I'm working at 2 or 3 RIR, 2 or 3 reps shy of that. So that's a typical recommendation there that I kind of stick with.
Okay. So that was kind of one of my questions as you were talking about, being able to identify reps in reserve. Mm-hmm. Is how well equipped you think kind of maybe your novice lifters or people that you have limit or little experience are at identifying what the reps and reserves are, because that's a real thing where I would say, without speaking negatively to just people in general, that most individuals that are novice lifters don't really interpret their RIR very well, or their reps and reserves very well. Yeah. I sometimes don't really understand, or I really don't interpret my reps and reserves very well either, depending on how lazy I'm feeling that day. Right. And I think that subjectivity of it plays a huge factor in why you would need somebody, let's say like yourself. Right. I'm definitely appealing to you here as far as training practices go, because you are your own worst enemy as far as having better gains, so to speak, because you are always going to make it easier on yourself. Right. And so that's a big thing, I think personally.
I agree. So you broke some really good news there. Turns out novice lifters, people who've never lifted before, don't know what they're doing because they've never done it before. So shocker, I would say most people who've never done something in their life don't know what they're doing in that specific thing. So it takes time to get to know your body, your limits, what failure looks like for you on specific movements. Obviously, you can't go through and do every single movement in one day, all the failure to get your baseline set for everything in one session there. So it just takes time to feel that out. Yeah, like you said, having someone there helping you discern that is very beneficial.
Right. So let's say across all the people that you would work with, let's say novice lifters, recreational lifters that are, experienced, but maybe not well trained, bodybuilders, competitors, things like that, across all your different competition levels or just level of training. you kind of spoke on all the different types of failure that you can go to. Do you recommend a specific type of failure over another one, I guess, for maximal hypertrophy, right? So obviously you're training until failure. Do you think there's a more effective one as far as, let's say you said technical failure earlier, right? Do you think that that's better than basically overall muscular failure? Like, is there a benefit to saying, okay, I can no longer actually perform this proper technique and still lift, but I can still do a forced rep or something, right? Is there a benefit?
Right. So with most bodybuilding style training, a hypertrophic style of training, we are becoming functionally dysfunctional in the movement, right? So I'm typically compromising some other bodily position to optimally activate a specific muscle. So I might be in curls, or like, I don't know, some kind of preacher curl, something like that. This may be a terrible example. We'll see how this goes, but I'm trying to isolate just the bicep here. For those of you listening, I'm pointing to my just absolutely massive bicep right now. But so I'm trying to isolate my bicep right here. Just this is the only thing that's moving. My forearm is the only thing that's moving as it's coming up. I only want the bicep activated. I'm not trying to focus on anything else. So there's dysfunction in the rest of my body position. If I was now, flip side, if you're now strength training, what is your goal? It's to move as much weight as possible. In that case, you're trying to utilize all the muscles in your body that you can in order to move that weight. To do that, now I might add some momentum in, some hip action in, some shoulder flexion in. So for purely hypertrophic training or hypertrophy training, I want to put myself in a dysfunctional functional position where whatever muscle I'm trying to activate is maximally stimulated without activating other muscles in my body, because that takes focus away from the muscle that I'm trying to train, takes energy away from the muscle I'm trying to train. So I think that's why it's going to be important to answer your question, maintain proper form. So technical failure. Mm-hmm. When my form starts to break down, now when I can no longer do this rep on this curl with proper technique, and I start to add in some shoulder flexion to get it done, now this bicep is not necessarily being actively or optimally activated. I'm having some shoulder flexion in there, whatever it is, to move that weight. At this point, I think it's now time to terminate the set, take your 30 to 60 second reprieve, and then do it again with proper form. Now, is that necessary? There's not some sort of benefit to some forced reps or things like that occasionally? Probably so. I think maybe, I don't know. Again, we're talking about a bicep curl here. This is going to be my standard example.
Yeah.
When was the last time that you didn't take a bicep curl to failure? Because like, it's a bicep curl. I'm taking this puppy to failure. So, but what failure? We're talking about technical failure, muscular failure. Generally, I think it's a good balance to play. Technical failure first, sprinkle in a little muscular failure as you become more advanced. But for beginner up to intermediate, technical failure is kind of where you need to live at. Unless, I don't know, these single joint movements, sometimes you got to think about the recoverability of it too.
Sure.
So like these single joint movements, bicep curl, like how long after you do a set of maximal bicep curls until you're ready to do a next set?
Not very long.
Not long at all, right? Okay. Flip side. How long does it take you to recover doing maximal deadlifts at 80 1RM, 8% 1RM?
For myself.
Okay. All right. So
annual deadlifts.
For those of us that aren't Austin, and might deadlift a little more often. These single joint movements, you can take to failure a lot easier, so your intensity can be a little higher. But for like compound multi-joint movements, maybe, definitely stay more to technical failure, because your recoverability is going to be a big kind of thing to think about here. How long is it going to take me to recover from this set, to do either my next set or recover from my next session? kind of depending on what you're doing, what your goals are.
Right.
So it depends on the movement too.
So then I guess that would lead me to, or then do a couple of things. So if we're just, like I said, I like the bicep curl example because it's so easy to
Yeah.
I use that in almost every single class when I'm talking about any type of exercise.
Everybody knows what that is. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when we talk about going into that technical failure where you can no longer do the rep, and you say intensity, are you defining intensity and load separately?
Okay. I personally am defining intensity and load separately.
I think it's fair to do, but sometimes when people will make those synonymous. And so when I think about doing or let's say I'm doing the bicep curl and I'm going to technical failure, I would imagine that load matters tremendously in an exercise like that. We're talking about technical failure. I guess, why are you failing, or why are you going through technical failure? How many repetitions did you do to get to technical failure if you wanted to induce something like metabolic stress, which would be what you would ideally kind of want to get to in some way to hypertrophy? I guess kind of what I'm getting at is, are you able to get to some level of metabolic stress with technical failure, right? Or do you not go through metabolic stress with technical failure if your load is too high, let's say, right? Like you actually just can't lift it, but not because you have like the metabolic byproducts building up in the muscle, right? You just actually like mechanically are unable to to lift it anymore, right? Because it's just too heavy and you're only able to do 4 reps. Does that make sense? And you never really got what I'm pump.
So you're asking, are we able at that point to generate enough metabolic stress to generate hypertrophy?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So
depending on the load, I guess, how much does that matter? Can you get there if you focus on the technical?
Okay. So if I am doing a set of super focus, concentric, eccentric contraction on my bicep and bicep curl, but I'm doing a weight that I can only do 4 to 5 times. Mm-hmm. The question now is, am I stimulating hypertrophic responses through, there's 3 mediating pathways here. One of them you touched on, metabolic stress. There's that metabolite buildup. Am I generating enough metabolic stress in those 4 to 5 reps? Am I generating enough, number 2, muscle damage? That's the second pathway here for stimulating hypertrophy. And then 3, am I stimulating or am I causing enough mechanical tension? So those are the three mediating factors for generating hypertrophy: metabolic stress, mechanical tension, and then your muscular damage. So I don't know that there's a good answer out there for that in literature. I think anecdotally, you can say, yes, if I'm focusing enough on, like, if you're doing, maybe you're focusing more on the eccentric portion, whatever it is. Now, if I'm focusing on eccentric portion of these 4 heavier reps, I'm definitely generating a lot more mechanical tension. I'm definitely generating muscle damage. The eccentric reps have been shown to generate more damage than concentric reps in the literature. But am I generating that metabolic stress? You would assume so. If you're generating mechanical tension and muscle damage, what follows that muscle damage? So what follows muscle damage after we damage the muscles?
I don't know.
Like in the muscle, like that's when we see the metabolite buildup happen, right? So
I was going to say, yeah. Does the metabolite come before the muscle damage, or does the muscle damage come before the metabolite? So like if it was
what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing.
Then I guess here we go. Then that would be that leads into my next question is, I guess, how contextual does all of that get? So I guess whenever I had, started the question originally is, can you get there at like specific, let's say at a controlled load at a controlled load and a controlled tempo. But now we can throw in tempo and things like eccentric training and stuff into the mix. That in that scenario where I'm like, hey, can you get to metabolic stress? If you throw in eccentric, yeah, you would get there, right? I guess how much do you, well, I guess personally recommend things like eccentric training? So, like I said, you say muscle damage is a really big one. When you go through that eccentric phase or a controlled eccentric repetition, the muscle damage is going to be significant, right? But you do get to that metabolic stress to initiate hypertrophy. The damage is going to initiate hypertrophy. Do you think, let's say, if you don't do within day volume and you go like between day volumes across a week, how much does doing the eccentric affect your overall volume for the week, right? Because you're going to have that muscle damage. What's kind of the recovery window? I guess, of course, that's going to depend on several factors, but how often would you recommend training with something that induces that level of muscle damage?
Right. So with these kind of techniques that are inducing more muscle damage, that are going to thus affect your recoverability, right? You want to, again, treat these as like a tool in the tool belt to be used every once in a while. So I know now if my first arm session of the week, when I'm doing curls, I did some accentuated eccentrics. Mm-hmm. I know now that, okay, maybe this second session during the week, I maybe can't push as hard if it's, you're within like your 2 to 3 day window when you're actually coming back to hit arms again. If you're doing like a bro split, whatever it is, I know now, okay, maybe I need to modulate my intensity here and my effort, and my loading rep sets, to accommodate for the previous significant muscle damage I just generated. Now, this is going to depend on kind of how you feel, your fatigability, your recoverability here. Generally, if you are able to recover between, if I do these bicep curls, 3 days later, if I am feeling nice and fresh and good, then okay, maybe you don't need to modulate based on the previous session's training. You're fine if you're feeling fresh after 3 days. If that 3 days rolls around again and your biceps, they're not firing quite as good, you definitely feel a little more fatigued, a little quicker. Now okay, because I trained with these elevated techniques, these techniques are inducing more muscle damage. Now I need to maybe drop back here to modulate the training today to increase my chances for proper recoverability the remainder of the week. Because obviously we're breaking things down. We need to be able to rebuild them. So yeah, it's kind of a nuanced answer, and it's going to depend a lot on you and what muscle you're training. But yeah,
I would also probably say that, again, it depends on, like, not that I'm super, I try not to appeal too much to just like the health and people who, the novice lifter category, but I would definitely just state that I would not recommend that probably. And I would say you would agree, things like eccentric training and like a novice lifter that's trying to just get into bodybuilding or trying to train for hypertrophy, maybe after they've been training for something else for quite a while, because it's not going to feel that great. Not that there's also an argument to be made like, yeah, hey, it's going to suck for a little bit. You're going to have to get used to it. That's fair. But I probably wouldn't recommend that for, like I said, your novice listener. That I agree with you is, hey, put that in the tool belt. So once it's time to switch some things up, then you can include that to give your body that new stimuli for you to adapt to. But I guess it still goes back into, right, like if I'm trying to get to create or if I'm trying to create hypertrophy in a given muscle, you say you need to be able to have or activate the muscle kind of individually by itself. When I think of that, leads me to think of two things. One is, how long do you think it takes to actually develop the capacity to identify or develop that kind of mind muscle connection? So I would say, like, I remember just being a novice lifter, like before, whenever I would do like back exercises and my biceps would just be on fire. I almost never felt something occurring in my back, right? How long it takes to actually get to that point where maybe you feel like you're actually going through kind of technical failure, right? I always would or whenever I was, like I said, or when I was younger, I would probably fail in my biceps or even my grip, right? Before I would ever even get to failure in my, my back muscles, let's say, if I was doing lat pull downs or something of that nature. And then, so I guess how long do you think it takes to develop that before you can even get to technical tension? And is there a strategy that you would use leading up to that point? Or like types of exercises, maybe? How do you get people to feel technical tension or not technical? Maybe I'm saying technical tension. I probably just messed that up a lot, but technical failure, my bad.
Right. So again, it's going to depend on each and every individual. Some people might adapt to this really quickly. Some people might be slow learners with it. I don't think personally, I really started to get a good feel for like finding that place where failure was, getting that good, air quote, mind muscle connection until maybe year 2 in the gym. Year 1 was definitely just like, I'm still figuring all this crap out. Like, I don't know how hard I need to work. Most people just getting started don't have a trainer or a coach, help them modulate that. So it's a lot of just like figuring things out, playing around with what works, what's working. So probably really you'll get good at it by like year 3, but like start to figure it out by, starting year 2 or so. But as far as like tools to help expedite that process, I think so. Like with your example of which a lot of people have this of my grip or bicep strength failing before my back does, which makes sense. Your back is a combination of a lot of bigger muscles than the ones that make up our forearm that handles our grip, right? So I used to do a lot more forearm and grip work than I do now because my grip work was so behind everything else. And that kind of helped catch up or help me catch up with my back. So now my grip isn't failing as much during these lat pull downs or rows or whatever it is. And I'm able to now focus on my back more because I'm not having to worry about so much my grip. Another thing, like an actual physical tool to use would be like hook grips or like Versa grips, something like that, where now the pressure is coming through your wrist and you're able to just focus purely on your back. Now, these are something I only would recommend using at the end of a training session when your grip has started to fail. If we're again just talking about a back movement, which is a common one for most people. So implementing those at the end once your grip has already started to fail, not using them at the beginning of training, go to the end. So now I don't have to worry about my forearms got a good workout. And now I'm able to focus on the muscles I want to focus on.
Right. Yeah. And I think, like you said, even at the beginning, that it really just takes time to be able to develop the musculature and kind of fix a lot of the imbalances that are occurring there. It really just takes a ton of time. I've gotten to the point now, and I'm, old relative to when I started lifting, right? Where grips, no grips, whatever's going on, I really never fail in my arms before I fail in my back. And so it really just takes our experience and time to be able to feel what's working and to be able to feel the pull and whatnot. Exactly. Now I kind of get back into, so yes, like you're going to have those, being able to identify the muscle is really important to technical failure. So then we go back to something like eccentric training again. What do you think is kind of is there, and if there is, what is it as far as the optimal tempo for eccentric training? And does it matter or does it depend, I guess, on the rep range and the weight and all of that as well? Or kind of what do you suggest as far as, eccentric seconds versus concentric seconds, so on and so forth, with time and attention?
So a good ratio that's actually pretty generally recommended across the literature for optimizing, these hypertrophy responses is like a 3-to-1. So 3 seconds, like just to make it easy, like a 3 second eccentric and a 1 second concentric. So like if any kind of 3-to-1 ratio like that is going to be pretty effective when looking at, I believe some of the literature's, most of the literature has just looked at like bicep curls. It's a really easy movement to standardize and analyze. So like 3 seconds in the eccentric and then a 1 second concentric. That's generally pretty effective. I use 3 second concentric or eccentrics with my clients in a lot of different movements. Basically, like generally all on machines, because most of my clients that I see are novice lifters in the gym. I have a few that are a little bit more advanced, but anything where that's able to take the stability out of it for them, where they're just purely now focusing on the eccentric 1, 2, 3, fire up 1. I think that is really going to kind of optimize our chances for these hypertrophy responses. Now you start to think about, well, if we go back to the old pro term here, actually there's some scientific basis to this as well. The whole time under tension is all that really matters thing. Shouldn't I do like 3 seconds and 3 seconds, really accentuate this all out? The answer is yes, but how sustainable is that? Like you got to think about your recoverability. Now, congratulations, you did that, but you can only do 1 rep with the proper load that you need to be moving. So I think it's a kind of a tightrope, like a balance to play here with finding what works for you. I generally find like a good 3 second concentric for most movements, especially like single joint movements, is really good because especially when you're going heavier overloading that you need to do with the eccentric movement. 3 seconds is just generally a good number. Going up to 5 can be really destructive sometimes and hard for them to achieve more than a couple reps, which even just for the mental feeling of success purposes, I don't want to do 3 reps because then I feel like that was terrible. Like I'm weak, so 6 to 8, then you're starting to look a little bit better. So
yeah, I was going to say, is there kind of an optimal rep range in there? I do remember at some point whenever I was lifting, I've pretty much been through every bro stage of lifting that over the past 10 years. I feel like it does change. Mm-hmm. So I have experienced all of them kind of collectively. It has helped, or I have learned by doing things the wrong way.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes the best way to learn. And that gets, kind of what I was thinking as you were talking was, okay, well, there was a time whenever it was, time under tension, it's all that matters. You need to do like literally just slow motion, 6-8 seconds eccentric phase, then explosive. And I'm like, well, by the time I get to 6 and 8 seconds, I need somebody to actually lift the weight up.
Exactly. Yep.
In the concentric phase for me. Now, I guess then, as I was thinking about it while you were talking, is you said being at the appropriate load. So this is now getting maybe off of eccentric training, but do you, and maybe not, because obviously it's contextual depending on the type of set or training that you're doing. Do you think that there is an optimal load for hypertrophy?
I think.
Broad question.
Yeah. Okay. So
load
generally,
weight you need to lift, just for everybody. Yeah.
So we'll talk in relation to like percentages of a 1 rep max for movement. Yeah. That's what we'll discuss this as. So I think in most people's minds, when you say if I say, hey bro, I did some squats today at 80% 1RM, what are you going to think? Is it a high effort day or like a high strength training effort kind of day at 80%?
Okay, we're getting into that line, I feel like, between strength and hypertrophy, right? At that point, whenever would I consider it a higher intensity day? Yes, I would consider it a higher effort day. if you were training at 80% of your 1RM, if somebody were to ask me, hey, I'm training at 80% of my 1RM and I'm training or I'm using that as a strength training technique, I wouldn't say I would argue that you're developing strength with that load. If somebody was saying I'm using that for hypertrophy, I would also say if you're going to failure, then I would also, if you're going to real failure, which at 80%, you should be able to get a decent rep range, right? Then I couldn't argue that that was not meant for hypertrophy as well. So 80%, that's where I think things get a little confusing.
That's 80%. It's like generally the cutoff for like, okay, now I'm approaching this strength training side of things as opposed to hypertrophy training side of things. So I think there is an optimal range here to be working at if you're really looking to maximize hypertrophy. It again is going to depend on the movement, but for the most part, you see 80% kind of being the top end, at the very top end. Moving like 80% of a 1RM. You might be able to do 6 reps, or something around there. Again, very contextual, depends on the movement, a lot of things, but we'll say 6 reps or so, you might be able to. Now, that's like the bottom end of the range for rep range now for what we generally see for hypertrophy training. If I drop it back to, say, 60% of my 1RM for our standard bicep curls here, now I'm up to 12 reps. Now we're smack dab in the middle of what was generally recommended for hypertrophy training. I think that is a more optimal range there. As then we drop lower. Now I'm at 40% of my 1RM. Now I'm doing 20 reps. Now you're like, okay, we're shifting even closer to the other end of the spectrum here. We're in the endurance factor of the muscle. But so I think really, if I just had to put like a good hard number on like a percent of a 1RM, somewhere between 40 to like 70 is a good range. Again, this is super contextual. It's going to depend very much on the movement that we're doing. Obviously, you got to look at the fatigability of the movement and stuff like that. I think if you're moving in that proper range, in like 80% or 70% of your 1RM for a bicep curl, that's fine because your recoverability is super quick.
Yeah.
I was working at, say a 1 or 2 RIR on that. Great. A minute or two later, I'm ready for another set. Now, if we're doing a heavy set of deads or heavy set of squat or sets of squat at that same 70%, now my recoverability and the fatigability of that is much higher. So my recoverability is changed there as well. So again, it just shows how nuanced of an answer this kind of is, very contextual. So,
yeah, I guess, whenever I think about it, so, I mean, some of the literature, some of the research that I've seen would suggest that, there was a time where it was, hey, if you want hypertrophy, you need to be working at about 70%, right, of your max, right? More of the recent research I've seen is that, well, that might not actually be the case. You actually should be now. Let's say whether or not it's optimal is a different story, and I think again goes into some different. It's contextual, of course. That maybe it doesn't necessarily matter what the load is or the percent of your 1RM that you're working at, or how much weight you should be lifting per set. That more is more associated with getting into that failure level, right? And I think that there is some maybe anecdotal merit to that. So some research would suggest it, but you also see people who are strength trained squat that have massive legs, right? And so they get there somehow. I mean, obviously, like their strength training, but their legs don't just get hypertrophic for no reason, right? So there's something to be said about maybe lifting the weight 3 times that can help you, right, grow muscle. And sometimes I think in my personal opinion would be that might be necessary in order to increase your training volume. Right. There may need to be some level of strength improvements. Now, a bigger muscle is typically going to result in a stronger muscle. So if you're training for hypertrophy, ideally you should be able to lift more as you gain more muscle. Now, helping you get to a point where you can actually lift more per set or more weight per set at the same reps. So like 225 on bench press, let's say I'm doing it 10 times. If I want to continue to grow, ideally I would need to overload that, right? I would need to go up to 250 for 10 times at some point, and that would be a marker of my muscle growth, right? But I got stronger. And so maybe sometimes doing smaller rep ranges can help me get stronger and then initiate some better hypertrophy later on down the road and kind of this downstream effect. And then maybe vice versa with the higher rep ranges. Now, I say that there's probably a cap on either end where doing it one time or doing like a squat one time is probably not ideal for hypertrophy, right? And then there's probably the other end of, let's say, 25, 30 reps until failure is probably another kind of extreme end. But I think there's a really broad range and where you can still have some hypertrophic responses in there so long as you're hitting almost near failure. If that makes sense. Would you agree or disagree? And it's okay if you disagree. I'm actually just thinking out loud more than anything.
No, I mean, that's pretty much on the nose, kind of how I view it too. Generally, there's the typical recommendations that we've always seen of 8 to 15 kind of range for hypertrophy, blah, 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 that kind of thing. There's some wiggle room there on either end, of course, but those recommendations are kind of been around for a while, but they've also been around for a reason. It's because it kind of works, So based on the literature, we can see that it works, and anecdotally, we see that it works because how many massive human beings do you see running around in the gym that are pushing, 30 reps, 40 reps on movements? No, they're moving that load for a 12 to 15 range or something like that.
I guess, how about this? I would probably, rather than say, hey, do whatever you want as long as you go to failure, I probably wouldn't recommend that. Let me backtrack a little. I guess it's more, I would say more of, I wouldn't recommend a gigantic deviation from that rep range, right? Because that's not, not a sure thing, but it's probably going to improve the certainty of having a hypertrophic response relative to other rep ranges and loads and things like that, right? Again, so long as you're going into some level of exhaustion or muscular exhaustion, right? I guess within that, I'm also saying I wouldn't recommend deviating from it. However, if those kind of really strict cutoffs on those rep ranges don't really change a whole lot, let's say we're doing the 8 to 15, you don't immediately switch over into strength training or muscular endurance by going a couple reps, right, on the outsides of those rep ranges. Kind of more of what I mean. Like it's maybe broader than we.
It's more of a continuum there, and sometimes I definitely miscalculate like my rep ranges on movements. So like I'll hammer out a set of 10 on some lat pull downs or something, and then I'm not like, I don't know, maybe sometimes I don't fully recover in time for the next set. I don't give myself enough time, or I just really misread how fatigued I am for that day. And then I'm only getting like the next set, like I only get like 5. I'm like, well, what the heck? I didn't just immediately that set start switching into strength training. That's sure. Not necessarily how it works.
So then I guess, even with that, so immediately switching, how do I want to say this? Man, I had it in my head. I forgot it. It's okay. I had something else that I was going to, or a comment that you just did anyways. So let's say I start off, right, at doing 10 reps. So let's say I'm doing dumbbell bench press just because that's what I'm going to do today. So maybe I just need some tips. But so let's say I'm doing dumbbell bench press and I start off with doing 100-pound dumbbells for 10. And my next set, I do 8. And then in my next set, I can barely squeeze out 8. My rest intervals, right? Or sorry, not squeeze out 8, but let's say I get to 7 and 6. Kind of, I'm just trending downwards, let's say, all the way, or as the sets progress. My rest intervals are what you would ideally want for hypertrophy, right? So if I'm doing anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute and a half, with minute and a half being more on the back end, right, of what you would want. But between there, let's say, got to send a couple texts in between that. Am I still going to get that hypertrophic response, right? Or would it be better for me to take longer rest periods to continue to get my 10 reps at that same weight? Or should I decrease my weight to be able to get this, or the amount of reps I want with the same rest period? I'm giving you a lot of curveballs here. I'm going to really test you. Or should I keep the same weight rest or in rest intervals, but let my reps decrease as the muscle is fatigued?
So I'm going to say this, and this might, I don't know, this might not go totally in line with, what the literature might say, or what other people will think. I'm going to say it absolutely does not matter, because in all those scenarios, you're compromising one thing and elevating another. And so overall, we'll use the overall encompassing intensity here. That's taking into account load and effort here. Your overall intensity is going to be very similar on all of those. You're just compromising one portion of it, say the rest time, and then now I'm elevating the number of reps I'm able to do, or vice versa. I'm compromising the reps I'm able to do for increased rest time. The overall intensity there is going to be generally equated. So I'm going to say, like, for the most part, for your most everyday average person, it's not going to freaking matter. Like, your intensity is going to be pretty much the same. Find something that works for you and kind of standardize and stick to it. I think, I don't know, maybe some other people might have some disagreement with that, but I'm going to say it absolutely does not matter. Like, as long as you're getting the work in, who cares if your your rest timing was 30-second different from, between reps, and you're only able to get 2 reps difference. I don't think it matters.
Yeah. So I would tend to agree with that perspective as well. As what's the percent difference we're going to get by changing one thing for another? And are we going to compromise another thing by a great, I think it all evens out. Right. And I think it goes to maybe what I forgot I was going to say, that one really big part of hypertrophy is making sure that you are testing yourself, right? That you're having an overload, or you're going through the progressive overload of everything. And specifically with that example, so let's say you wanted to continue to meet the same rep ranges at the same weight, but you're having that downward trend. So ideally, the strategy then would be to increase your rest time, right? Well, how much are you letting that muscle recover and basically clear out some of that metabolic stress that you've created, right, from that point? And so now the metabolic stress is cleared out. You're not having as big of a hypertrophic response because of that, because you've taken these longer rest periods. And then, disclaimer, there probably is an extreme on the rest period as well. So when I say, like, yeah, you're going to increase your rest period, let's say that we're not saying 5 minutes or so between sets. Let's just say it's long enough to be able to get you to the same rep range at the same weight. If you're going too long, well, now you're going to basically start clearing out some of that, or some of the metabolic products. You're recovering more, so to speak, and maybe that's not what you want, right? Just to be able to get the increased reps. But you also don't want to take such little recovery time that you do 10 reps, and then you do it in 30 seconds, you can only do 4 reps, right? And there may be some utility to that. And again, it might even out, right, for the most part. And so there's a lot of kind of things to swivel through, but it goes back to just saying, hey, as long as you're testing and fatiguing the muscle, then that's probably going to be the best case scenario, which is one thing I do agree about throwing in a heavy set every now and then, is because if we really want to create a new adaptation to be able to lift more weight, you got to try and lift more weight. And it might not go up 8 times, right? But maybe next time, instead of doing 225 8 times, you can do 245, right, 8 times, because you've kind of had some increased strength from a heavier lifting phase. And again, it doesn't have to be, a 2-rep max. But let's say we're really trying to push it for 6 and we only get 5. That's fine. I would imagine you would agree with that.
Yeah, no, right on line there. I think if in order to increase the weight you want to do, then you need to lift the heavier weight. You pretty much said it. You're going to see your responses both have, in the muscle and then the neural adaptations as well. From just feeling that weight, you'll get stronger just from the neural adaptations on top of that. So, yeah.
Okay, so then I got another question. Now, again, this is I'm actually just writing all of this down because I'm getting free training from you now. But so I'm a big proponent, and it's not necessarily because it's like the biggest, most well-researched thing. Now, there's a lot of research on this topic, but I do it from a time efficiency perspective, because I get 1 hour per day to have some level of balance in my life and still be able to work out. I'm huge on doing supersets. So what are your thoughts on supersets? It's okay if I'm doing it completely wrong, but what are your thoughts on supersets? Is there a type of superset you recommend? And I guess situation, like everything about supersets, just go, right? What do you think?
Yeah. No, supersets, they're great. The end.
There you go.
No,
that's what I said. No, I'm telling people, man.
So practically speaking, supersets are very useful for getting an increased amount of volume in a decreased amount of time. For people like you who might be more squeezed on time, I think they're a very useful tool to have in the tool belt to use. Say if you only have 30 minutes, but you have really 45 minutes worth of workouts to do, okay, maybe now implementing supersets is going to be beneficial in order for you to get your proper volume in. Now, here's when the question might start being asked, okay, well, what about my recoverability between sets? To that, I would answer, don't be dumb. Don't stack, don't superset chest press with chest flies,
right.
Pick some movements that are antagonists of one another to superset, or just different regions of the body. Because you're really going to be affecting your recoverability and increasing your fatigability here by hammering out, synergistic movements back to back. Now, if you want to now flip that on someone's head and say, okay, I want to use the synergistic movements as a superset during my workout, like at the end of my workout, to really end with some serious blood flow and some really overloading the muscle at the end of your training. I would say another useful tool in your tool belt, just make sure you're not overdoing it, and that it is at the end of the workout, so you're not over fatiguing yourself for the remainder of your workout if you do it at the beginning. So there's kind of 2 different ways to look at it there. Useful tool to use throughout a workout using antagonist movements to get the overall volume in that you need. Another way to use supersets with synergistic movements, stack at the end of the workout to really get a good, some really good stimulation and overload and blood flow. Like today, I supersetted try some bodyweight dips with decline push-ups, right? So I am doing synergistic movements there, but I was using it just body weight on both of those to failure, just to really overload the muscle in the training. If I did that at the beginning, now guess what? I don't have the energy to go through and get all my volume in that I need to do for my chest and triceps. But yeah, so useful tools in the tool belt both ways there.
Yeah. So then there you go with I like the idea of low load at the end of the workout synergistic movements. I think that's
Mhm.
a great tool. You said not doing something like that at the beginning. So then you would probably say that you don't, would you or would you not say, and again, contextual, so it may depend on the situation, totally fair, pre-fatiguing. What do you think about pre-fatiguing?
I'm of the camp of I'm going to be fatiguing the muscle during the workout anyway. So why do I need to pre-fatigue something
Sure.
that is going to be, if I'm doing my workout correctly with the
Mhm.
proper intensity, that muscle should be being fatigued properly by the time it's done. So I don't think pre-fatiguing is necessarily something everybody should use. Again, could be a useful tool in the tool belt every once in a while, even for advanced lifters, to maybe pre-fatigue something. Again, if your training is going the right way and you're running the right way, no reason to pre-fatigue because it should be fatigued at the end of the workout.
Sure. So then how about this? What about with um, a common split would be chest and tries, right? What about maybe not even superset, but doing things like that? I'm doing chest and tries. The tries are obviously synergistic to me doing something like a bench press or bench press, right? Am I hurting one or am I hurting, let's say, one or the other, right? So let's say I'm going to do tricep pushdowns. Obviously, doesn't have anything to do with my chest. Is doing the tricep pushdowns going to influence how my chest performs on things like bench press, right? And then vice versa. I'm going to do bench press, and there's going to be some tricep activation going along in bench press. Is that going to influence my tricep performance? Is there an optimal way to do that? Because that's some level of pre-fatiguing, but you're fatiguing a synergistic muscle to allow for better activation. I don't know if, in my personal opinion, if I would want to do something that way where I'm like, okay, my bench press performance is dependent on the capacity of the synergistic muscle, right? Is it good for me to fatigue it? And then obviously there's the order of exercise and multi joint movements before you do, all these different components that go into it. What do you think about that type of a split, and what would you recommend?
No, I think you started getting on the right trail there. We're talking about order of exercise,
Yeah.
and these different these compound versus single joint movements. There's a reason you generally see most programs, exercise programs, and people going in training doing the compound movements first.
Mhm.
All right, so doing like the bench press first, and then the accessories after. Because on bench press, you want to be able to move enough load to properly overload the chest, and then the triceps are just synergist with this. So for proper hypertrophic training, bench press is generally a lower chest movement if you're doing it correctly. And the triceps are just synergist with this. So I want my triceps to be fairly fresh to where I'm able to not worry about those as much being fatigued before being over fatigued before my chest is, right? So this goes back to the same thing you're talking about with your forearms fatiguing before your back. I don't want my triceps to fatigue and a bench press before my chest because I'm really using the bench press to be a chest movement first, tricep movement secondary.
Right.
Order of exercise now says, okay, I need to do this big compound movement first in order to make sure my chest is getting the proper load and proper mechanical tension and things like that. Now, afterwards, I will go do my tricep work since they were not the primary movers of the bench press.
Gotcha. So then, do you think? So I would tend to agree in doing it or that way. So would you agree with doing a tricep and chest superset, or no?
Sure, as long as if you're doing like a tricep extension and bench press superset, as long as your bench press is fairly submaximal, like 60%,
Yeah.
then like that's something where you're like, okay, that's plausible. It's something you can do, and now it's also not a safety concern that you're going to drop 300 pounds on your chest because your triceps are fatigued. Be intelligent with it,
I really just want to know, because I have my, when I have my like pre-pump hoodie on, what do I need to do so when I take it off, I just look more massive than I ever like do normally. So that's kind of what I wanted to know. But so then so within that, yeah, I would tend to agree that at a given load, I would imagine it doesn't really matter too much if you were to do a superset between those two muscles. I think one thing with doing the supersets is there are some muscle groups that are more favorable for supersets of or agonist antagonist movements than others. So I'm generally of the camp of, in the same line as you, I probably wouldn't over fatigue more than for a small training change to kind of just switch things up a little bit on doing like chest press, then chest press, then chest press, right? As a superset, right? Whatever chest press angle that you want to do it at, decline, incline, regular, dumbbell, however. I'm generally not out of the camp of doing that all the time. I do like to do, or I'm in favor of agonist antagonist. It's hard to find the exercises to be able to do that in more of like a commercial gym setting. So it's easy to do things like biceps, triceps. You have the pulley system up here, and you put the pulley system down there, right? That makes a lot of sense. Things like hamstrings and quads, let's say, it's hard to kind of figure out really good ways to do that without taking up a bunch of dumbbells and a bunch of space, being in the squat rack, doing a million different things. That's something I personally kind of struggle with, to switch it up and not do the same supersets each time. So I guess that's not even a question. That's more of a comment that I have of just like, I like it. I don't like having to go from this side of the gym all the way to this side of the gym.
That's why you just be an equipment hoarder, right? Just take all of your equipment that you need and then just go bring it to your corner of the gym over here. And so nobody else can have it. Anybody that tries to ask, you yell at them.
I'll never forget. I was in Lubbock, and this was back in the day when it was like whatever CT Fletcher was doing. Again, not that I disagree with what he's doing, but he has his own gym, so he can do whatever he wants, right? No matter how crazy it is. And I think it was him, whoever it was, bodybuilder, was doing all this crazy stuff. I'll never forget. I went into a gym in Lubbock, and someone had taken every single one of the dumbbells, but only a single dumbbell in the set. So 120, 130, 140, and was doing like a major drop set from like 100 on dumbbell rows all the way down the rack, and had kind of taken all the dumbbells of a single dumbbell of each set. And so nobody could do anything else. It was so funny. I could only laugh, but of course, like, I'll never forget things like that. But I was losing my train of thought here. One thing you kind of say, as we're talking about exercise and what matters, how we're going to get the activation, is blood flow, right? So what do you think about BFR, or blood flow restriction? Or maybe explain what that is, and then do you include it or do you stay away from it? Kind of what do you think about it?
Yeah, so the blood flow occlusion or blood flow restriction training, it's now at the point where it's been around long enough to kind of be in the mainstream, more in the mainstream audience. Basically, what it describes what it is, you are restricting blood flow to an area, you're occluding blood flow into an area. So most common use for it is you see, like in the gym at least, different uses in the recovery setting, physical therapy setting, when they use it sometimes too. But most common you see it right above the bicep to occlude blood flow and make blood pool in the extremity. So making blood pool in the arm. Basically the idea is to increase metabolic damage and metabolic buildup in the muscle that you're trying to actually work here. So if this band is now around my arm tight, blood cannot enter back up into the systemic system. It's now occluded here and pooling in the bicep. The idea is to really build up the blood flow to the area and the metabolic stress in that area to now then promote proper shuttling, remodeling of the muscle in that area. I think it has its uses. I think there's some of the initial research coming out was like, this stuff's, it's awesome. It's going to be great for inducing hypertrophy, you know?
Yeah.
I think now as the literature has evolved a little bit, we see, really not. I forget who just recently put a paper out on it, but that's neither here nor there. I'll find it and link it. But now it's starting to find like really might be seeing some really moderate effects as far as hypertrophy goes, if any. Again, I think it can kind of be a useful tool in the tool belt to mix in every once in a while for these single joint movements. Obviously, like there's only a couple specific things I can think of when you'd ever use it. It would be like on a bicep curl. I guess you could use them on tricep extensions. I have personally used it occasionally and seen people put them up around upper quad during like knee extensions to really kind of occlude blood in the quads. Outside of that, there's really not a lot of practical use for it. Now, these are really, these are some money muscles that people want to grow. So more power to you if you want to mix it in every once in a while. Then I think that can be a decent idea, especially like if you are recovering from like a knee injury or something like that. Now it might become useful for you. If I cannot move the load needed to cause proper mechanical tension and metabolic stress in the muscle I'm trying to work, now I can use this blood flow occlusion to increase the amount of metabolic stress that's happening in the muscle, which is one of those three hypertrophic pathways. So now I'm increasing the metabolic buildup happening in this muscle. I'm not moving as much weight, but now, so like my mechanical tension is not as high, but the metabolic stress is higher than it would be if I was just doing this super lightweight without the occlusion.
Right.
So just a tool there.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I was thinking too, is maybe before I even get into this, would you say you kind of had to rank, the importance of things to initiate hypertrophy kind of within day volume and then across or between day volume or across a week volume, however long you want to equate your volume for, those would typically be some of like the most important things, right? To initiate the hypertrophy kind of over time, right? Rather than just like this within day, that was a great hypertrophy based workout, right? The overall volume I think is really important. And I think as I was thinking about blood flow restriction and how you can, or how that influences volume, is it's basically an artificial enhancer of volume, right? So you're going to induce a high volume effect that you would normally get, say with metabolic or stress, right? Or increased metabolic stress, but at a really small load, right? And so as I was thinking about it, I thought the same thing as you, which was, okay, why don't I just do 70%, right? For a normal rep range, or 70% of my 1RM for a normal rep range and get normal volume. And then I thought about injuries. Like, okay, yeah, that'd be great for injuries if I don't want to put that kind of mechanical stress on an injured joint. But then you go into like you said, the money muscles is, well, I only have so much utility in blood flow restriction, right? I can only really put that in a couple of different places. And sure, you can probably get some decent effects on the knee, right? But I don't know how much that's going to do for you when it comes to these multi-joint exercises. Eventually, you're going to have to do these multi-joint exercises and blood flow restriction. I'm not certain that it's going to be as helpful, especially in things like squat, right? Where you're going to have all of a sudden you've been training blood flow restriction, and maybe I'm right or wrong on this, but you're doing blood flow restriction. You've got these great quads and hamstrings because you've been doing blood flow restriction and focusing on, quads, hamstrings are things you can get benefits from with blood flow restriction. But then what about the glutes, right? And so now all of a sudden you've got this terrible imbalance. Well, is that much better for the injury, right? That you were trying to have it? Sure, for single joint exercises, I would imagine, right? It might feel much better. because you are putting that kind of stress on it. And maybe it's great for recovery over time from a major injury, right? But then you go right back into not having a balanced, strength for multi-joint exercises. So I think there's something to consider there too. And I guess reference to blood flow restriction. Now, I guess as we're kind of getting close to being going for a little bit, I'm curious about what you think about drop sets, because I personally like drop sets, not necessarily. So it's not because I'm like best research best research out there, undeniable type thing. But I actually just have fun doing the drop set. It helps me really feel like I'm getting to actual muscular failure. And there, yeah, it helps me feel that way. What do you think about doing those? And then I guess, what do you think as far as hypertrophy goes?
Yeah, so I think, again, that's just another great tool in the tool belt. For now, caveat, great tool in the tool belt for upper intermediate to advanced lifters. Yes. I think you need to earn using these tools. So I think drop sets are a tool to be used for these more advanced lifters. If you are a new lifter, I think you need to focus on right now moving the load and moving the weight in proper cadence, generating this mechanical tension, moving the weight properly for a certain amount of time first, and then being able to implement these drop sets and things like that later on, because these are very muscle damaging inducing techniques here, both with drop sets and like blood flow restriction and things like that. It's really going to affect recoverability and things like that. So I think it's something that needs to be earned for more upper intermediate and advanced lifters. I think there's some really good data out there showing that drop sets are useful for kind of as a useful for a tool in increasing your chances of optimizing your hypertrophy. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld has a great article on like where he talks about all the mechanisms of hypertrophy and techniques used for hypertrophy. Drop sets is one of them he includes in there. Very useful tool. I think it's, again, something keeping your utility belt there every once in a while, because it is a very muscle damaging inducing technique, which is good. Yeah. We're trying to induce muscle damage, right? That's the goal. It's the goal there for trying to induce hypertrophy. So again, just kind of mindfully using it.
Yeah. And I think even as we're getting close, kind of getting closer to the end of this, I think that, we talk about a lot of stuff, obviously, and it goes all over the place. When we say a lot of these things as far as initiating hypertrophy, I really think your use of the word tool in the tool, or the phrase tool in the tool belt, is really, really important. And there are a lot of things I would imagine you would need to consider. And the first one would be, where are you in your lifting experience? I probably wouldn't recommend 90% of the things that we discussed for somebody who's very novice in lifting, especially things like drop sets, right? And again, I'm no expert personal trainer. I'm no expert coach, bodybuilding coach, or prepper, anything like that. I can do it, but it's not my expertise.
Don't sell yourself short. It's okay.
I'm above average, let's say. But I wouldn't recommend a lot of what we've talked about today for the novice lifter. And that's because, even like I said, with things like drop sets, let's say you can bench press 135 X amount of times, right? You're, like I said, new into lifting and whatnot, and you try to do a drop set, your muscle is not equipped yet to be able to do something like a drop set. So all of a sudden you're doing 135, and even if you drop that weight down to, let's say, 50% of that, I've seen it happen a million times, where it goes from, okay, I did 135 this many times, I'm going to do an immediate drop set, even at that level of drop, and that weight's not going up. That muscle is dead, right, after a lift like that. So again, yeah, I think it really depends on the level of the person. You should really just focus on doing the proper form. You should really just focus on doing the kind of rep ranges that have worked for hundreds of years, I would say, not really, but however long from the history of bodybuilding, right? 8 to kind of 15 rep range at a 60 to 80% load, right? The rep range would match the load, or the rep range would match the load. Stick with those foundational principles. Now, eventually, you're going to need to change things up a little bit. There will come a point when you have completely adapted, and you can always do just basic progressive overload. Okay, yeah. And you can make sure that you're getting optimal volume. But then that goes again into when we're at the kind of next level up of maybe not novice, but recreational, relatively experienced person. Okay, now we need to start thinking about volume here, right? Like volume is going to matter or quite a bit. So we need to make sure that our training is optimizing our volume. So let's not try and just overdo it on Monday, right? And then destroy the volume for the rest of the week. So one thing to consider. And then you can start getting into more of the specialized movements after you've kind of gotten your volume figured out, right? Which is then, okay, at, max the volume that I need to be getting, I need to change up my stimulus. Maybe let's throw in some eccentric training, right? Okay, maybe let's throw in some drop sets. Let's actually superset this, right? Let's identify some weak areas, things like that. And so I think there's that progression that would need to occur, I would imagine, right? And that's kind of a big disclaimer is all these different tools start from the beginning, start with the basics, right?
I think you said it pretty good there. These tools are something to be earned, obviously you're not going to start using, you think practically here, you wouldn't start using more advanced training techniques with beginning athletes in any area. So, it's the same concept here in the gym.
Yeah. And, I think that's another thing too, is not that it's related to like how people see things on social media, but not necessarily as influenced as others. But, just because you see somebody doing it doesn't mean that you are ready to do something like that just yet. I think that's where we get from is you get the dichotomous, this is the best way to do this or do that. There's a good foundation on a way to get there. Maybe you should just do that before you start incorporating everything that you see. There's some utility for it, but I think that's again more of, hey, I'm a person on social media. This is a tool in the tool belt for you to use if you're already experienced and just need something new and don't have the resources to be able to figure it out on your own, rather than, oh, well, I just started lifting, but X bodybuilder does this type of training.
Yeah.
And so this is the type of thing that I need to be doing because this is what he does.
Yep.
That's great and all, but don't compare yourself to other people.
I agree. Yeah. And it kind of comes down to the need for people with a social media presence to be responsible with what they're putting out there. But they also need to be a responsible consumer, and understand that just because somebody else is doing it that works for them doesn't mean it's going to work for you, especially like with more advanced movements. If I see, Chris Bumstead doing something on his Instagram, God, maybe I need to be, that's exactly what I should be doing.
That's why I didn't get invited to the Olympia.
No, it's not what you need to be doing. That's what Chris Bumstead needs to be doing. You need to be doing what you need to be doing, so.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that goes into, you said responsible consumer. That's also really important too. So yes, be a responsible, or be a responsible producer of content, right? But also as a consumer, understand that sometimes people are trying to promote, themselves and their brand, which is fine. I totally agree. There are a lot of people that do that have been very helpful to myself, right? And you and everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But you also need to know that and be able to self-identify your experience level accurately, right? That you are not always ready to go up to, I guess, those levels, right? Even if you might want to. So, all right.
You said it.
Man, that was a good one. I think
the people have heard all that they needed to hear. So if you guys have made it this far, I absolutely applaud you because we're terribly boring to listen to. So thanks for tuning in. We will do this again. And as always, if you have any ideas or suggestions for things you want to hear us talk about, please shoot us a message on Instagram. We will ignore those completely. and do whatever we want to do because we're self-centered human beings and we want to talk about what we want to talk about. So yeah, we appreciate it. And as always, thanks for listening in.
All right. See you guys.